Governor Ron DeSantis was in St. Augustine last week signing a pair of bills that could have major impacts on police oversight and accountability. Here to talk about that is retired police detective Kim Varner, a 26-year veteran with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. Hey, Kim.
How you doing? Good morning, Ann. How you doing?
Good morning. On the line, we have April LaNubian Roberts, community activist with the new Florida Majority. Welcome, April. Whoop, my bad. Morning, April. How are you?
Greetings. I'm well.
Great. And we're also joined by Andrew Bonderud, Jacksonville civil rights and criminal defense attorney. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, good morning. Good to see you.
So, Andrew, let's talk about this bill. There's actually a pair of bills that the governor signed. One would create a no-go zone of 25 feet around working first responders. The other basically kind of guts police oversight boards. But let's start with the buffer zone. From a legal standpoint, is this an infringement on the rights of people, assuming it's a public street?
I think it certainly could be. I think it's susceptible to being challenged. It may very well survive a facial challenge, but I could imagine somebody at some point withstanding bringing an as-applied challenge. It certainly vests a lot of discretion, almost unbridled discretion with officers to warn basically whomever they want to back away from them. And then if that person who's received the warning either approaches the officer or remains within the buffer zone of the officer, that person can be arrested if they have specific intent to do a number of things that would be otherwise criminal already, including harassing, threatening, obstructing. But the law doesn't require any of those other crimes to actually have been committed: obstruction, threatening. Just having the intent to do that while remaining within the buffer zone is sufficient to have a completed crime.
So this law takes effect in January 2025. It's a second-degree misdemeanor, which means it would be punishable by up to 60 days in jail. And Kim Varner, this is, again, an intent to harass, threaten, impede, or interfere. You've been in the field for a long time. You've had a lot of arrests that you've made in the field. How significant of a problem is encroachment that is dangerous to police officers?
And it could definitely be a problem. I can recall numerous times being out there in the field, making arrests, when it was just my partner and out there by ourselves, and the crowd would gather around us. And, it can become a scary moment, very scary moment, because you don't know what that person's intent is. I was listening to Andrew saying, depending on their intent, you don't know what their intent is actually until they do it in a situation like this. So we've had people that we've arrested for trying to incite a riot at the same type crime scenes because the police were outnumbered. My question is, I wonder how will they educate the public on this law? Because a lot of people out there on the streets not going to hear about this, and I just hope it doesn't get, it's not abused. That law isn't abused, because I can see that happening.
Sheriff Robert Hardwick spoke at this bill signing ceremony that the governor was at last week in St. Augustine, and he said he believed the law was necessary and practical.
And what this does is it sets up that boundary, that protective area around us, so we can do our jobs. We're blessed in the St. Johns County where we have this partnership and relationship with our community that stand behind the blue, just like you, Governor. And with that being said, this simply just gives us the law and gives us that latitude to enforce something that someone doesn't want to listen, doesn't want to pay attention as we continue to do our jobs. So again, with Senate Bill 184, it simply gives us the power to enforce.
April, as someone who's participated in protests and also called for police reforms, what concerns, if any, do you have about this bill?
Well, my biggest concern is the people that are the police officers that are possibly covering up something. I think that everything should be transparent. Like, it is known in our communities, we work as a village. So when something happens, We want to know what's going on. So a lot of times people are just gathering to see what's happening, to see if it's possibly one of their loved ones. Now, we witness in our communities police officers coming and not being on their best behavior. And a lot of times people coming out and looking will stop things from happening or could prevent those things from escalating. So I think that we wouldn't have been able to solve what happened with George Floyd and see it in its fullness if that lady who recorded, I know she was closer than 20 feet, wouldn't have been able to record for the world to see what was happening in Minnesota. So
Yeah.
for me,
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. For me, it puts us in a fearful place of being arrested when we're just trying to find out what's happening in our neighborhoods. And that to me is truly unfair, and it's going to make people very frustrated because we know things happen in our community that don't happen in other communities that are really not cool.
So, as you mentioned, the woman who shot the footage of George Floyd's murder was 17-year-old Darnella Frazier. She described her position as about 5 feet away. And, you know, that incident, as we know, was initially reported as just a medical incident, not as anything more than that. Kim Varner, to her point, do you think does the community just being there change police behavior? You know, having them close enough to see what's going on, as April suggests, does that have some effect on how officers conduct themselves?
I definitely think it does because of the cell phone cameras and so many cameras that exist today. When I first came on the job back in 1984, not so much because it was your word against the police officer's word when you go to court. And a lot of times they're going to rule for the police officer. So I think the cameras make a big difference now. And I agree with what April is saying. I mean, you know, the fact that you're there to see what's going on, as long as you're not interfering, you're just there to see what's going on. It's one thing, but when someone starts interfering, it turns into a different thing. And my question is this: if I'm that officer there making an arrest, I'm already arresting someone, and especially if I'm out there by myself, I'm making an arrest on that one person. Once I get them cuffed and put them in the car, then I got to go and try and grab someone else out the crowd. And it's just, you know, unless you get a lot of backup there in time to make those arrests and make them effective, it's I think that, I don't know, I just see it as it's going to be interesting to see how this works. I'll say it like that.
We have a call from Daryl in St. Augustine. Good morning, Daryl. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. Has anybody actually been charged, or has this actually happened? When you sue somebody or you do something like that, you have to have standing. In other words, you have to have it has to have happened to you so that you can do it. They seem to be writing a law that has no standing. I just can't imagine any public person harassing a police officer in their duty. They have a gun. You don't. Why would you harass? I just don't believe anybody's harassing police officers.
Interesting. Thanks, Daryl. I'm going to get to the legal element in just a moment, Andrew. But Kim Varner, you're actually just laughing about that statement.
Well, that happens every day. I mean, and I'm smiling because of the fact that it happens every day. People, the citizens don't care that you're wearing a gun. You know, I've had people, you know, curse at me and you know, call me everything but a child of God out there on the streets. You know, that the fact that I'm wearing a gun doesn't make a difference. So
and they'll get close.
And they'll get close to you. They'll get close to you. I got newspaper clippings from once the media rode with us when I was working in narcotics. The media rode with us, and they was taking pictures of the crowd. The crowd was right up on us. My sergeant is standing 2 feet, or not even 2 feet, a foot away from a female that they're going back and forth, and you can see in the picture the girl yelling at him. And this was a juvenile yelling at him, and you can see the crowd standing around her yelling at him. This was out off of on the north side, and like I said, this was a while back. So, and things have gotten worse out there. It ain't gotten better; it's gotten worse. So, but I see it both ways. I think, and we were discussing it earlier. If the person that filmed George Floyd wouldn't have been able to be close enough where you can actually hear things and and see what actually took place 25 feet. Probably could have saw it, but not the same view that we were able to see. So I see it both ways. Being a police officer, being out there on the streets, I can understand. I understand the law. I totally understand the law. I just hope that it's not abused and officers take advantage of it.
Andrew, I want you to address the question that Daryl raised. Typically when somebody makes a complaint of some kind, they do have to have standing. But for a law like this, for law enforcement to ask for it and to have it approved by the legislature and the governor, it doesn't necessarily require that same threshold. Is that true?
So somebody could attempt to bring a facial challenge.
Explain what that is, a facial challenge.
That would seek a pre-enforcement declaration that the law is unconstitutional and therefore unenforceable. Or somebody with standing could allege that the law, specifically as applied to that individual, is going to be applied unconstitutionally, would somehow infringe the plaintiff's constitutional rights.
So to his point, you would need to have been cited for this. You would have needed to been given a misdemeanor, and then that is how you would acquire standing.
It's conceivable that somebody could bring an as-applied challenge pre-enforcement, but both of those situations would be difficult. Certainly, the law has identified a lot of things that constitute, compelling government interests, preventing harassment, preventing violence. But there's some examples from recent history where courts have struck down similar, not identical, but similar laws. I think this law is called the HALO law because the governor wants to put a halo around police officers.
The physical distance.
Right. In the early 2000s, Massachusetts wanted to put a halo around abortion clinics. And so they passed a law imposing a 35-foot buffer zone around entrances and driveways to abortion clinics. And when it reached the Supreme Court, Justice Scalia struck it down, found it unconstitutional because although the law didn't specifically address speech on its face, it nevertheless restricted access to traditional public fora and therefore
like public sidewalks.
Sidewalks, exactly. This law doesn't specifically address location, and so it is distinguishable. There was another law in Arizona that specifically proscribed filming police officers within, I think it was 8 feet. That got struck down.
Prescribed, for those who don't have that word, means prohibited. Right?
Prohibited.
Okay.
Right.
So basically, if you were within 8 feet of an officer, you were not allowed to film. That Arizona law didn't withstand a challenge.
And that was a little bit different analysis. The Massachusetts law was subject to forum analysis and First Amendment scrutiny related to that. And then the Arizona law was based on the clearly established precedent of one's right to record police officers.
April, I want to ask you about this setback. We've talked a little bit about the George Floyd circumstance where a distance of 25 feet, perhaps you would have been able to see it, but maybe not here. And, what he was saying as he was pleading for his life played in very much to the, what charges were ultimately brought against those officers and their murder convictions. I wonder if you have thoughts about any local incidents that have, caught your attention where there's been video involved and that has raised concerns. April?
Let's see.
Well, I will say. Oh, go ahead. One that had caught my mind, I guess, was.
No, I have one. I have
sure.
one
Okay.
for you. So let's go back to the case with Brittany Krishan Williams, because she's my neighbor, actually. So Brittany Krishan Williams actually is a person who made films. So she had, well, let me just go back to what happened to Brittany. Brittany was assaulted by the police in her home after going to a police officer and asking him what she could do for him when he pulled into her private driveway, right? So Brittany had her own video system set up and her own recording of what happened between her and police, which was very different from what was shown on the police cams, right? Brittany was 105 pounds, Black woman, assaulted by the police in her foyer, right? Because according to them, she was a little too spicy with her mouth in front of her husband while he's handcuffed. When we, the community, saw Brittany's video and we saw the police cam footage as activists, we were able to see that. It told two different stories. So my thing is, we didn't have anybody from the public recording that. We had her herself, the person in the community, having their own recording, going up against what happened with the police footage. And for me, I think that that's transparency, because those same people that assaulted Brittany have been, those same police officers have been in other cases of using a lot of force and violence. And that young lady still got issues to this day from that experience with the police. So
good point.
That's the story that comes to mind for me, Brittany Krishan Williams.
We have a call from Linda in Mandarin. Good morning, Linda. Go ahead.
Yes. I don't want to be hyperbolic, but it seems like we're reversing democracy and turning into a police state. So we have no citizen review board option. We now have, you can't record. So what if I'm on the end of my driveway and I see something happening? I'm on my private property, but the police officers are X number of feet away. I can't record it. What is going on here? It really, and now we had that recent incident where the police officer turned off his body cam. So the police or the sheriff's union can go to the state and ask for a law preemptively and expect us to trust them when they come up later that they weren't properly trained and they turned off their video and they get a slap on the hand. I hope we understand that this won't be applied equally. And we won't have the documentation to prove the things that has happened since people have had their phones. We have, for the first time, had officers be held accountable.
Right.
Without that, we're back to the Wild Wild West.
Thanks, Linda. I mean, to be clear, this law doesn't preclude anybody from videoing. They can go back 25 feet. They can continue to video. It was the Arizona law that had that restriction. But it certainly does place a distance. And, that can have an impact, Kim, just in terms of what we know about an incident. I was going to mention the February incident where an officer is still under investigation by JSO, but an officer was seen slapping. You could hear him slapping a handcuffed suspect, a man that had been pulled over. And that video was taken at night. It's not really hard to discern. I mean, some of it anyway. So it's not clear that that would have been captured if this law had been in place at the time.
I agree with you. I think distance makes a difference as far as the clarity of what you're going to hear and actually sometimes what you're going to see. Backing up 25 feet might put you in an angle where you might not be able to see the same that you were able to see when you're up close. So I agree with that part of it. And I don't know. I wonder how they're going to educate the public on this. That's my big question.
So explain what your concern is there, because, this has been publicized somewhat, as of the law signing Friday. There have been a few stories written about it previously. What do you think it would take to get that information to the general public?
Well, I follow the news. I follow the news pretty closely. I watch all 3 channels, and I follow the news pretty closely. But I didn't even hear about this until you called me about this interview. So, if I follow the news and I didn't hear about it, the people out on the streets that's not living the way they're supposed to be living, they're not going to be paying attention to this, and just the fact that how you going to educate those people of this law? I mean, is it going to be the first time they show up to a scene and they interfere and then you tell them to back up, you'll be arrested? It's going to seem like it's always been, if I'm one of those people living in the community and I approach the police when they're arresting somebody and I'm saying something, hey man, you ain't got to do this, you ain't got to do that. That's the way it's always been. So that person continues to do that, you tell them to back up. The police have always told you to back up.
Or you'll be arrested.
Or you'll be arrested. So just educating them, and don't get me wrong. As a police officer, you want your space to be able to conduct that investigation because you don't want to get sucker punched. You want people throwing things at you. You don't want, like I said, I've been in that situation numerous times. So I can see why the law exists, but I just wonder how you're going to educate the public on it.
And Andrew, we should say this isn't just for law enforcement. This is for all first responders. So if paramedics are at a scene and they're trying to treat somebody, they too can establish that perimeter.
Right. With respect to transparency, I think we're in a much different era than we were even a few years ago. Whenever there's a scene with multiple officers present, all of them have their body cams running. Thankfully, the reason why it was such news that this officer turned it, what April was talking about, where the officer turned his body camera off. That was noteworthy because it's just not common. Most of the time, the body-worn cameras of the JSO are really helpful in identifying misconduct and also false allegations of misconduct.
And you review a lot of body cam in your line of work.
Oh, yeah. And it's very rare for an officer to, intentionally turn off his camera and so that it doesn't capture something. But I'll also say, while it seems like a poorly drafted law, it seems like a lousy law. It also seems to me to be completely without a need. It seems to me that there are already laws on the books that would address every single situation in which this law could be applied. If an officer is conducting an investigation or attempting to make an arrest and somebody interferes with that officer, I don't know why the officer would take the steps to be able to arrest that individual for a second-degree misdemeanor when the officer can already arrest that individual for a first-degree misdemeanor of obstruction. And if somebody is not obstructing, then I don't know why we would want to criminalize that person's behavior, which is, I guess, theoretically what this law would do. So it seems to be a solution without a problem.
What would make it not a lousy law in your mind? Is there something that could be added language that would make it better?
Yeah, in my view, so every crime, with very few exceptions, require not only a criminal frame of mind, the mens rea, but also an actus reus, which is the conduct. Normally, and it's not as though it's impossible to discern one's criminal intent. The state attorney's office does that all the time. But normally, criminal intent is coupled with an act that is, inherently bad, making a false statement, committing a crime of violence, obstructing. In this situation, somebody's behavior could be criminalized if they have the mens rea, the criminal intent, but then the criminal act is them remaining in the buffer zone without obstructing, without threatening, without committing any other act that constitutes a crime. It seems to me that we've got plenty of laws on the books to empower law enforcement to be able to do their jobs without being unduly interfered with. April,
I want to ask about that, as well as, is there a middle ground? I mean, I think this law, whatever its flaws, is aiming to create a safe space so that officers and first responders can do their job and not feel that they're, even just kind of people in their space. I mean, if you're just trying to help somebody in a medical emergency, you don't want people, up in your area and talking or distracting. Do you think that there's any happy medium for what officers and first responders are trying to achieve here, and also protecting your interests as, someone in the community that wants transparency for officers?
It would probably be family members, if any. Hello?
Hey, I'm sorry. Go ahead, April.
So as far as the first responders, I think that people recognize that they're there to help their loved ones. And people in the community may be looking because those are their loved ones. They just want to see their face or whatever. But they're not that close to where these people are unable to do their work. I think the only time you find people out there asking for questions is when something is happening and they see the police being rough or mistreating of people. We know that the only way that we can tell the story is through getting close, using our phones, making them, see that there's accountability there. So I feel like whatever this law was created for, it's not happening in the community that I live in. I don't believe that the people are doing that. Now, there are people that may be on substances, and those people, will be looked at differently. But that's far and few between. I think it's up to the police to educate the community, come and start having better relationships with the community, because once again, we don't have a civilian review board. We don't have anything to keep them accountable. They have all the different things that are protecting them with, their, rights that they've created for themselves over the years. So we know that we don't have a lot of recourse to fight. So it's really up to them to start coming in our communities and building better relationships, which I do see some police officers doing their best to do that. But we need overall everyone to be doing that together. Gotcha. And figuring out ways to make sure people know what this new law, means for us in relations.
We have a message or a note from Joss on Facebook. She says, if this buffer law was in effect in Minneapolis in 2020, the murder of George Floyd by a cop wouldn't have been caught on video. This seems like another attempt by law enforcement to cover themselves from scrutiny. And then Tom on Facebook says, these bills taken together show a clear intent to remove police officers from any public scrutiny. Here in Jacksonville, we've seen a pattern of abuses by Jacksonville sheriff's officers, most involving excessive force. Allowing these actions to be cloaked from the public will allow police conduct to go unchecked. So as to April's point and Tom's point, there is this other bill limiting the role of civilian review boards, and that's something that the governor spoke directly about during his appearance on Friday.
That just shows you, though, what I think people in uniform can be up against, because whether you did the right thing is not what some of these folks in the media care about. The media cares about is can they contort that in a way that is going to cause titillation, that's going to get more clicks, that's going to drive more viewership, that's going to cause more controversy, and they're perfectly willing to use a faithful law enforcement officer who's done it by the book. They're totally willing to throw that person under the bus if they think it can further the narrative.
So that's the governor. He's talking about civilian review boards. The other bill that he signed at that ceremony, basically, there are some civilian review boards in Florida. A handful of cities have them. But this would really restrict and basically eradicate their function, because it would allow them to come back under the control of the police chief or the sheriff, who would appoint the members. Kim, that would seem to sort of defeat the purpose of a board if it's appointed by the sheriff.
I can speak on this. As far as here in Jacksonville, and me personally, I'm not for a citizens review board, and the reason why is because I can't go to someone else's job and tell them how they're doing their job if I'm not familiar with it. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but I can't go to any company and tell that person, they call me in because I'm a citizen of the community and they want me to sit in on this review board for disciplinary reasons. And I don't know their policies and everything. I don't know I don't know what that person goes through when they're working there. I can tell you this, that our internal affairs unit will get after you. I mean, a lot of people think that us policing the police isn't effective. I can tell you that it is. I've known people who've been suspended. I've been suspended myself for acts when I was a police officer by Internal Affairs. Internal Affairs investigates cases fully, and they don't discriminate because it's policing the police. I can't convince a lot of people of that. I can only just speak from my experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. Andrew Bonderud, I mean, the civilian review boards, as Kim Varner says, they very often are people that are either somewhat outside of the world of policing, perhaps from a policed community, and sometimes, are naturally sort of, if not antagonistic, at least, critical of the mission of law enforcement, as opposed to what these panels will become under this new law.
Yeah, it seems to me that police officers aren't the only ones who should be able to give feedback about how an incident happened, how an officer behaved. I don't think it's. I think it's a sledgehammer for a problem that I think arose in, was it Tallahassee, where there was a very anti-cop, very antagonistic member. I don't know if it was Tallahassee or Orlando, but I think that was the seed that led to this law. But there are other ways for citizens to give feedback to the sheriff's office. One is if there's a violation of constitutional right. Obviously, they can go into court and file a lawsuit, and if that doesn't work, and the sheriff's office is not responsive, he should get voted out.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Andrew Bonderud, Kim Varner, April Roberts, thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much.